So then what is the definition, what is the standard of good if you're a non-Christian? And there are two basic outlooks on this. The unbelieving world will say that good is what evokes approval, or on the other hand, good is what achieves certain chosen ends. On the one hand, good is what evokes approval, and then there are schools of thought that say good is what achieves certain ends. Let's begin with the first of those options. Good is whatever evokes approval. There are two forms of this outlook on ethics. The one says that good is whatever evokes social approval. The other says good is what evokes your individual personal approval. That is to say, the evoking of approval is either society at large or the individual himself, herself. Well, let's take the view that good is what evokes social approval. Let's take this philosophy and see where it leads us. If that is the case, then a sentence such as, the entire society willingly went along with the evil of oppressing the Jews. Now that sentence seems to make perfectly good sense. But if good is defined by what evokes approval, then it would be by definition impossible to criticize a society for what it does. But even unbelievers criticize societies for what they do. They believe that societies are humane or inhumane. They believe that societies are too warlike. They believe sometimes that societies are too uptight about sexual ethics. They make evaluations of societies as a whole, and those evaluations would be meaningless if good is whatever evokes approval by the society at large. Moreover, we ordinarily think of things evoking approval or disapproval, if you want to look at the negative side of ethics. We ordinarily think of things evoking approval because they are good. We don't think of the evoking approval as constituting their goodness. You understand the difference? If you ask, well, why did that evoke society's approval? Or why did that evoke society's disapproval? We tend to think that good and evil are attributes of the things, events, activities, attitudes in themselves, and not simply another way of speaking of evoking approval. The unbelieving world cannot even understand the logic and the language of ethical discourse. The very things they say are meaningless given their philosophy of ethics. We would have absolutely no right to criticize another culture for, say, expecting that the widow of a man will throw herself on his funeral pyre and burn to death, and force her to do so if she refuses to do it willingly. There are societies that have practiced that. Not many unbelievers want to say, hey, well, it's different strokes for different folks. I guess if that's what they think is good, they go ahead and do that. We tend to say that's horrible and they should be changed. We tend to think that cannibalism ought to be changed. That child abuse cannot be made acceptable just because it's widespread in a culture. We don't think that genocide is acceptable just because Hitler's Germany put up with it. And so the unbeliever can't live with that particular theory. Now, the idea that good evokes individual approval rather than social approval ends up in what is now called the emotivist theory of ethics. That when we talk about ethical terms like good and evil, we're just giving expression to our emotions. Good is not an objective or public quality, it's just a subjective expression of your emotion, which then makes ethics impossible and completely subjectivistic. So this idea that good is what evokes approval, either social or individual, doesn't make any sense, cannot make meaningful the judgments on ethics that every unbeliever makes. And so we go the other direction. How about the idea that good is what achieves chosen ends? That is to say, something is good when it leads to a certain consequence, when it's the means to a particular end. Utilitarians tell us the good that we should try to achieve, the consequence that we are aiming for, is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Hedonists that are egoistic, on the other hand, tell us the good we should be looking for is our own individual happiness, pleasure, and well-being. But now, either way, if good is what is conducive to the end that you have chosen, the question has now just been transferred from the means to the end that the means is supposed to be unto. That is to say, when the unbeliever says, I mean by good that which achieves social happiness or individual well-being, the next question is, well, why is the greatest happiness of the greatest number good? And you can't say because that achieves a certain end. If you define good in a consequentialist, or what is called a teleological fashion, if good is that which is conducive to a certain end, that already assumes that the end is itself good. And now we're right back into the thick of it. How do you know that that is good? And the unbelieving world doesn't have an answer for that. It's like, well, everyone's just supposed to take for granted that your individual well-being is good. You're just to take for granted that the happiness of your society is good. But even then we have to ask, in saying this, what do we mean by the word good? The unbeliever knows in his heart of hearts, in her heart of hearts, that good has to do with matching God's attitude toward things. Evil is that which goes contrary to God's feelings about certain things and against His character. And they use good, the language of goodness and evil, in that absolutistic way, and then they try to find some theory to cover it up. As Paul says, I find that you are very superstitious. You have all of this evidence of ethics around you in your society, and yet you can't make any sense of ethics, given your worldview. And so this God that you worship in ignorance, this absolute standard of goodness, that you know is there, but you cannot understand given your worldview, I can declare unto you. So there's one